Good morning. Welcome to Hope One Live, ladies and gentlemen. As we go through this coronavirus lockdown, we're trying to bring you hope every day. And the question we're going to deal with today is, did the apostles really die for what they said they saw? Did they really see a resurrected Jesus? And how did the apostles in general handle suffering? Well, for that, there's no one better than my friend Dr. Sean McDowell, whose doctoral dissertation was on the fate of the apostles. He comes from Southern California. Here he is, the great Sean McDowell. Sean, how are you this morning?
Frank, all things considered, I think I'm doing about as well as I could do, although we're all wrestling through this thing. My family's hanging in there.
Good, good. I spoke to your dad the other day. He just called me out of the blue and said, "How you doing?"
Oh, that's awesome.
Your dad's great, man. He could still sell ice to an Eskimo. The great Josh McDowell.
Oh, my
goodness. By the way, was very instrumental in my coming to faith, reading Evidence Demands a Verdict and More Than a Carpenter. And I know you had a lot to do with the revisions of those, Sean, particularly More Than a Carpenter. That book has now been redone, and it's been updated quite a bit. It's still a great book.
Yeah, that was a really fun project doing both of those, because I think when it's all said and done, More Than a Carpenter and Evidence Demands a Verdict are probably the two books that have had the greatest influence that reflect my dad's heart. And we did More Than a Carpenter. It was almost a decade ago now. And then just within the past couple of years, updated Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So Evidence Demands a Verdict, the year it came out, got one of the awards of the year in its category, which to me was just a way of honoring my dad, which made it really special.
Yeah, they're saying, Jorge, that my audio is pretty bad. That's okay. You don't need to hear me. You need to hear the great Sean McDowell. So let's go right to Sean. Sean, why did you want to study the martyrdom of the apostles? How did that all come about?
Well, I was actually on a trip to Berkeley with a group of 25, 30 high school students. And we bring in atheists, and we had in a gay activist, and we had in just these apologetic mission trips. And I just started my doctoral classes, so I was looking for a topic. And this mythicist, who I'm sure you know as well, was speaking to my students. And one of my students said, okay, wait a minute. If Jesus didn't exist, why would all the apostles die for a myth? And without missing a beat, he goes, how do you know any of them died? And a handful of students looked at me like I'm supposed to know. And I had that moment like, I maybe don't have as good of an answer as I should. And that night, J. Warner Wallace was there. I said, hey, what do you think about this as a doctoral thesis? And because he's a detective, he goes, hey, I just bought 2 full boxes of books. I was planning on going through that. You can have them for starters. So I started launching into this research thinking surely somebody's done this. And even 2 full boxes of books was just a drop in the bucket of what it takes to do a doctoral research. But as I got into it, I really, when it's all said and done, wanted to know for myself, how did the apostles die? Are these traditions and stories true? And is this good evidence for the resurrection?
Well, The Fate of the Apostles is a great dissertation, and it's even a book now. I know it's pretty expensive to buy, but I got a copy of it, and it's very well done, Sean. You have a kind of a scale in there of 0 to 10 or 1 to 10 as to your confidence in regard to the evidence we have for the apostles' martyrdom. How did you come up with that scale? And when you conclude, who really has the highest level of confidence in your mind that they really did die for Christianity?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I was at Southern Baptist. So at the time, Russell Moore was there, and I asked him to go to lunch. And I remember he said to me, he said, once you write down your outline for your dissertation, and once you come up with a good kind of grid, so to speak, of analysis, a historical methodology, everything will fall into place. I thought, great, I'll start there. Well, it took me hours and hours, because if you're asking a historical question, as you know, doing doctoral research, I have to have a methodology that I make public to everybody. And so I came up with from the most probable to the least probable, and a way that I would assess the historical evidence for the different apostles, and then including James and including Paul. And even people like Tim McGrew, who's really good with philosophy and statistics and probability. I sent it to him. I'm like, hey, is this good? So it took me hours to come up with that. And then I just started going through each apostle, starting with Peter, going through James, going through John, and just trying to assess what confidence do we have. And Bottom line, I would argue that of the 12, there's only 2 that we have very high confidence died, historically speaking. And
Mhm.
that's Peter and James, the brother of John, James, son of Zebedee.
Mhm.
And I would say outside of the 12, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, we also have very high confidence. And then there's 2 I would put in that middle range that are arguably more probable than not, but the sources are less and they're a little late. That would be Thomas and Andrew. And the rest of the 12, what's left of them, I think that's 8. I don't think we know when history ends and legend begins. The sources are late and they're contradictory. We
Mhm.
just don't know that. That's the honest truth of, I think, where the history points.
So Christians have overstated the case in many regards. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, Christians have, including me, before I did this research. I just parroted the line that everybody said. I'm like, yeah, they all died except John. And then interestingly, Frank, people have been emailing me documents. There's a lot of scholars reconsidering John, making the argument that he died as a martyr. Now, I'm not fully convinced, but
Hmm.
that's one of the things that surprised me in my research. I went in assuming he died in the island of Patmos. He's not a martyr. But then when you get into some of these early traditions, there's at least a decent case for John that if I ever did an update, I might even revisit that.
Hmm. Well, there is kind of a counter side to this too, in the sense that I've been told this, and you would know because you did all the research on it. Is there any evidence that anybody recanted and said Christianity was false?
So this is a really important question, and it gets to
Mhm.
the nature of what is a martyr.
Hmm.
And let me answer this part first, because I
Okay.
had to read all this martyrological research to define what a martyr is.
Hmm.
And I realized there's a lot more extensive research here than ever crossed my mind. And essentially, I would argue that a martyr is somebody who lays down their life for their belief that they had seen Jesus, for their witness that they had seen Jesus.
Hmm.
The pushback comes from people is they'll say things like, well, if they didn't have a chance to recant at the moment of death, then they don't qualify as a martyr.
Hmm.
And the reality is we don't have any good early sources of say Nero or his cohorts saying to Peter, "Hey, we won't kill you if you recant." We don't have that for Paul. We don't have that for James or John,
Hmm.
any of them. So does that mean they don't qualify as martyrs? Well, what I found in the research is there's a number of scholars who will say if you knowingly put yourself in harm's way for a message you're proclaiming, and you're put to death in a way tied to that proclamation, you still could qualify as a martyr. And I think that's actually very reasonable because there was a story, I think it was 2016, of this priest, this French priest by the name of Jacques Hamel.
Hmm.
And he was actually giving communion. And in the middle of giving communion, some radical Muslims walked in and slit his throat and killed him. Now, there's no record that he had a chance to recant. But what's interesting is the president of France and the media and Christians and Muslims all call him a martyr.
Hmm.
So I think we have to be careful what we mean by a martyr. But to be honest, Frank, when it's all said and done, pun intended, I don't want to die on the definition of martyr.
Right.
That, that's really not what's most important. The
Hmm.
question is, did these guys really believe they had seen the risen Jesus? And do they put themselves in harm's way, willing to suffer and die for this proclamation?
Hmm.
If so, minimally, it shows they're not making this up. They're not liars.
Right.
They really believe it.
In fact, I heard you say this on a recent Unbelievable broadcast, which just came out last week. Unbelievable is a show from the UK, moderated by Justin Brierley, and you were debating a YouTuber by the name of Paul Enns, I think his name is. And I was on this very topic, the martyrdom of the apostles. And the Paul, the gentleman on the other side, who's a former Christian and now I guess he considers himself an atheist or agnostic,
Yeah.
was saying that he only accepts Peter and Paul as true martyrs. And you brought up, well, James and he didn't seem to recognize there were three Jameses. So maybe you can clear that up for our viewing audience now. Who are the Jameses that are in the New Testament? And a couple of them at least were martyred. Who are they?
Well, there's at least 5 people in the New Testament referred to as James. And this gets to one of the difficulties in my research is you actually see Paul, he got confused for a moment, which happens. The early church fathers got confused.
Sure.
They started confusing James, son of Zebedee. I mean, in my research, sometimes I stopped. I'm like, okay, which James am I talking about? Easy to do. Well, I think 2 of them would qualify as martyrs. James, the son of Zebedee, was one of the 12. He's the brother of John. And he's in the 12, but he's in that inner circle of Jesus. For example, he was with the raising of the daughter of Jairus. He was one of the 3 apostles that was there. He was one of the apostles, I think it's in Mark chapter 9, where he goes to the transfiguration. James, John, and Peter were there. He's also one of the only apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane. So James had this close connection and insight to the life and ministry of Jesus. Well, we have a death account of James in Acts 12 too, where it describes, and what's interesting about this is no flowery details are told. And in my discussion with Paul, I compare Acts 12 with the story of Stephen being martyred in the early Acts. And clearly when Luke is writing Acts with Stephen, he's drawing out all the similarities between Jesus and between Stephen. Now, some skeptics will dismiss the story and say it's been made up because it's invented to look like Jesus. Now, I don't buy that. But I said to Paul, I said, fine, I'll give you that argument. But then you can't turn around and critique in James 12:2 when it simply says Herod took James, had him killed by the sword. As Craig Keener says, this reads like a straightforward execution account without any unnecessary flowery details. So I think we have solid evidence that James died. Now, it's only one source. So Gary Habermas said he wouldn't put it in his minimal facts, which is fine. He doesn't put the empty tomb in his minimal facts.
Right.
We still have really good reason to believe the tomb was empty. So that James, I think we have solid evidence. And there's later accounts that corroborate the story in Acts. James, the brother of Jesus, is very interesting because when it comes to James, we know James was an eyewitness because in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says he appeared to the 12, he appeared to Peter, and he appears to James. Well, James was not a follower. The brothers did not believe in him during his lifetime, we know, from Mark 3 and John chapter 7. And then he becomes the leader in the church, we learn in Acts. Well, when it comes to James, we have Christian, Gnostic, and secular sources that he actually dies as a martyr, including Josephus at the end of the 1st century. So I think we are on solid ground concluding that both James died as martyrs, or at least minimally, if we want to quibble over the definition of martyr, we know that both of them believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Both of them intentionally put themselves in harm's way and are both put to death, yes, with political means, but with political means that cannot be divorced from their proclamation of the risen Jesus.
Yeah, I think as the way Josephus puts it, there was a kind of a lull in the high priest with regard to James, the brother of Jesus, and was it Annas, or I can't remember the exact name used there, but he says he took the opportunity to get rid of James, basically, and that would be 62 AD. And Josephus is probably in Jerusalem at the time because he lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. Now, as you know, he writes it later.
That's right.
He's in Jerusalem, and he would know if this really happened. James, the brother of Jesus, dying. So you're saying that we have good evidence of the 12. We have good evidence for Peter. We have good evidence for James, the brother of Jesus. And we have good evidence for James, the brother of John, Zebedee.
Yes, that's right.
So 2 Jameses and Peter in terms of the 12.
Yep.
And then you would say also Paul, but let's hold on to that for a second, because I gotta ask you this. The skeptic you were debating, Paul N, said, well, we don't know if James, son of Zebedee, was killed because he was preaching.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say to that? What's the response?
Well, So it's a fair question
Yeah.
to say, I mean, if somebody robbed his house and killed him, would he qualify as a
Yeah.
martyr?
Right.
And of course not. So I think it's great
Right.
that he's asking this question. And I think what sometimes skeptics want to do is they want to say this is entirely political.
Mm.
And I want to say it doesn't work that way. Jesus was put to death for
Mhm.
religious and political reasons,
Yes,
for
absolutely.
both. You
Mhm.
cannot separate those.
Mhm.
Well, James is put to death by Herod. Obviously, not Herod the Great. He was long dead, but I think it's his grandson, Herod at the time, or grandnephew, puts him to death, and it pleased the religious leaders at the time. So he has him beheaded for political reasons, but why pick James? Because James was one of the outspoken leaders of this Christian
Right.
movement.
Right.
And at the heart of the Christian movement is this proclamation that Jesus had risen from the grave. So James is out preaching this,
Mhm.
knowing that he's following a crucified Savior who's put to death as an enemy of the state of Rome, by the way. John the Baptist was beheaded. Stephen is already killed. In Acts 4 and 5, they're being threatened, beaten, thrown in prison. And James continues to proclaim this message.
Mhm.
So we cannot separate the political element from the religious element as well.
Sean, a lot of skeptics want to discount the anything from the New Testament. Not true New Testament scholars, but some of them. It almost seemed like the gentleman you were debating the other day on Unbelievable was saying, "I can't trust Acts because Acts is just copied from Josephus or some crazy
Yeah.
story like that." And they always seem to want to get stuff outside the Bible, as if the Bible documents can't in any way be trusted for any reliable information. Why don't serious New Testament scholars take that position? Because serious New Testament scholars know that there's a lot of good historical data in the New Testament documents, regardless of whether or not they think it's inspired. So can you disabuse people of the notion that you can't use anything from the Bible texts as good historical data?
Yeah, I think this is actually hard for Christians and for non-Christians, but because we all have this perspective that's like it's all or it's none.
Right.
Either the Bible is 100% inspired and there's no errors, or it's a worthless historical document.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the question of inspiration and is an in-house important theological doctrine for Christians to wrestle with. But even if we were wrong about inerrancy, as important as that is, it wouldn't follow that therefore the New Testament and the Gospels are not reliable historical sources.
Mm-hmm.
And even if there's certain things the New Testament got wrong again, and I don't think that's the case, it wouldn't follow that it got nothing right, and we couldn't still get a historical core out of the New Testament documents. So I think in people's minds, and it's hard for people who haven't been trained to think this way,
Right.
to separate the spiritual, religious, you might call them faith questions, from the historical questions that we're wrestling with. So I think inside the church, it's hard for some people to do that. And on the flip side, I think skeptics just have a double standard. They'll say, do you have any evidence outside the New Testament? And I just simply say, okay, let's talk about the existence of say, Caesar. Do you have any evidence outside of Roman sources? Let's start there. And they'll look at me like I'm nuts.
Yeah, right.
Nobody does that.
Mm-hmm.
We should look at historical sources with a consistent criteria: Christian, Jewish, Roman, Greek, etc. Are they early? Are they reliable? Do they match up with other external sources? And when we simply approach Acts that way, I've actually been reading Craig Keener's new commentary that is just coming out, and I'm working through it. And he's a very sober New Testament scholar. And he goes, look, just by the standards of historicity of its time, Acts is a very reliable historical document.
Well, that's what Roman historian Colin Hemmer said when 30 years ago, he wrote the book Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And the data that he gave in there, and I don't even think Hemmer was a Christian, but the data that he gave in there, particularly about certainly that Acts is written by 62 AD, would rebut any sort of allegation that Acts is copied from Josephus, because Josephus hadn't written anything by 62 AD. He was just about to become a rebel to try and overthrow the Romans. He doesn't write until like the 90s. If anybody's copying from anybody, it's Josephus from Luke, not the other way around. And I know you had that little bit of exchange with Paul on the Unbelievable show, but what would you say to him now if you had more time on that question? Like, oh, Josephus is the one that Luke got all his information from. What would you say to that?
I would say a couple things. Very interesting. When I started defining a martyr in our discussion, Paul said, well, you're relying upon evangelical scholars. This is not mainstream. I wasn't, but that was his argument. Then when it came to Josephus, he took a total fringe position that almost no New Testament scholars take, that says Luke is copying from Josephus.
Yeah, right.
So what I should have done at that moment, I always think of the moment after, I was like,
oh, so do I, especially when I'm debating my wife. But go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Even if I am debating my wife and I think of it, for wisdom, I still let it go for other reasons.
That's right.
But one of the things I want to point out is I think he had a very hyper skeptical, inconsistent methodology in terms of what sources he accepts and which sources he doesn't. Now, according to Craig Keener's commentary, he says almost all scholars date Acts between 70 to 90, most within the 80s. So it's a minority of scholars in the 90s, and it's a minority of them who would say he copied from Josephus. Now, where they talk about common issues, Luke and Josephus match up, but they describe things very differently, that it just doesn't seem like one is copying the other. Now, the other point that I would make is we know from Luke 1, and almost all scholars agree, that the same author of Luke is the same author of Acts.
Right.
Luke in 1:1 says, many others have taken to write these accounts. And I researched everything carefully and accurately, is what Luke essentially says. Okay. So if he wants to claim that that Luke is using Josephus, the other thing I could have said is, okay, what if I concede that point to you? That means that Luke is using a good historical source of his day, namely Josephus. So when he says he's citing these other accounts, doesn't that tell us we can trust him to use good, reliable sources? So on the one time we know for sure, outside of course, Mark and Matthew in that question, he uses a good source. Shouldn't we give him the credibility in other cases when we cannot confirm his sources? So I think the skepticism of dismissing Acts because he allegedly copied Josephus is just a bad argument that, if you flip it on its head, actually even makes my case for me.
Yeah, that would mean that Josephus was the one that actually is the source for Stephen and James, the brother of Zebedee, as well. Is that right? I mean, so Josephus is saying this. Is that right?
Well, that's interesting. The question would be how much, and we have to look at the areas that overlap.
Right.
So because he used them, I don't know that it would follow he used them for everything. I'm not sure. But we know he's a good source. And if he pulled from him, which again, I don't think he did, that only would give Luke credibility.
Yeah, I really think that Hemmer's case for Acts dated to 62 is quite strong. I can't go through it all now. We have it in the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, but certainly there's no mention of Paul and Peter being martyred. But he talks about Stephen and James, son of Zebedee, being martyred. Yet the whole focus of the book of Acts is Peter and Paul. Why isn't he mentioning their martyrdoms if it's written, 20 years after they were martyred? It would make absolutely no sense. Now, I know people are saying it's an argument from silence, but there are other arguments too that Hemmer makes that seem to indicate that Luke is writing Acts by 62 AD, no later than that. Go ahead.
I had to wrestle with that argument because I think there's a good case that can be made for that earlier dating. When I read even people like Keener, he cites other historical sources that end at a certain period, and we know they're written later, but they don't include later material.
Right.
And that wasn't uncommon in the ancient world at that time. So that's at least one point that gave me pause. So I have to ask, what is the purpose of what Luke is doing?
Yeah.
And part of what Luke is doing is he's writing to a Gentile audience, and he's not softening the message of Jesus, but I think he's trying to show it's more compatible with the Roman Empire than a lot of people think.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean he changed. It doesn't mean he tweaks. It means he tells the story in a certain fashion. And so I think arguably there's hints in the book of Acts that parallel the story of Jesus and Paul that tell us Paul is going to be crucified, but he's just not given it to us explicitly, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm actually interviewing Keener the week after next, and I really want to unpack this with him and see how much he buys those parallels.
Right.
But that might be one reason he doesn't. Other scholars are like, maybe he was going to write a third book. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities here. I think when we move from arguments to silence.
Mm-hmm.
So I just, historically speaking, was not sure how much I could get out of that argument.
Sure.
Even though in More Than a Carpenter, when we updated, I put it in there because I think people should be aware of it, and it's a good case to date Acts early.
Yeah, but on the other hand, as you say, even if it's dated late, if he's copying it from Josephus, it still doesn't hurt your case. So it doesn't really matter in that sense. I want to go back to what you said earlier, that or what we were talking about earlier with regard to the New Testament documents. I think people need to realize, and I never realized this until relatively recently, that when we think about the New Testament documents, Luke is the only Gentile, right? Everybody else is a Jew.
Mm.
And the question is, why would they invent this resurrection story when they didn't even believe in a resurrection inside of time? They believed in one at the end of time. And then why would they go suffer and die for this? And we put it this way in our presentations on this, to say this, that the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. In other words, they're writing about the resurrection. They're not creating the resurrection. It's happened, and now they're writing about it. Otherwise, why would you have Jews in the first century putting their lives on the line for something they didn't think was possible, that a man could be God and he would resurrect from the dead in the middle of time? They didn't think that was possible going into it. After it happened, then they went, oh, wow, actually the Old Testament talks about this, but going into it, they didn't recognize this. So I think that's a point we need to make with regard to this.
Yeah, I've never heard you word it that way. And I think I've heard your presentation maybe 100+ times. It just slipped my mind for whatever it is. So just giving you a hard time. But one of the arguments or one of the facts that I had to demonstrate is that the earliest belief the apostles have is in the risen Jesus.
Yes.
If the resurrection shows up later, which you're responding to this objection that they believe something else earlier and the resurrection is added on top of it later on, then their willingness to suffer and die doesn't prove anything for the resurrection. But what I found is every single early source that we have consistently points towards the idea that if you believed in Jesus, you believed he's the risen Lord because he's risen from the grave. And that's in the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. That's in other creeds, like in the first part of Romans chapter 1. That's the creeds in 1 Peter. That's in all of the Gospels. This is in the rest of the New Testament. It's in the early church fathers. So the earliest source we have is that to believe is to think Jesus had risen from the grave. And frankly, what you said is, pun intended, by the way, what you said is exactly right. There is no reason, if you're inventing a movement, to have a crucified Messiah, because it was a dishonorable death in a culture that was an honor shame culture. I mean, I just interviewed Abdu Murray, our good friend Abdu, and he has a new book out he wrote with Robbie, Seeing Jesus from the East. And he makes a point, and he goes, look, they never, if you understand this Eastern culture, to be crucified, tortured, public, stripped naked, it is absolutely counterintuitive on every level to invent that for your Messiah.
Yeah, so, especially since Deuteronomy says anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse.
That's right.
It just didn't fit. Sean, we'd be remiss. We want to get to questions here pretty soon within the next 7 to 10 minutes. So I want to mention to our viewers, if you have a question, type the word question in big capital letters and make sure it's a succinct question in complete English. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the sources we have for, say, the top 4 or 5 people, apostles, that we know actually did die for their faith. What are the sources we have for Peter? Let's start with Peter.
Okay, Peter's important because he's clearly the leader of the 12, most often cited apostle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Peter, we have at least two first century sources.
Mm-hmm.
We have John chapter 21 at the very end, where
Mm-hmm.
he's talking with Jesus and Jesus restores him and says, "This is how you will die."
Mm-hmm.
And as I said in that recent discussion, even Bart Ehrman says when this was written, John knows there's a tradition people are aware of the martyrdom, and he uses the word martyr of Peter.
Right.
The other first century source is Clement, which is probably written mid to late 90s, interestingly, from Rome to
Where
the church.
Peter was
Corinth.
martyred. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in chapters 4 through 6, it's basically about this idea that jealousy leads to division and ultimately to death. And he talks about Peter and Paul and how jealousy towards them led to their suffering and their deaths. So that's two first century sources.
Mm-hmm.
And then through the second century, I would argue there's 10 sources for the death and martyrdom of Peter,
Mm-hmm.
of varying strengths and clarity,
Mm-hmm.
that unanimously and consistently say that Peter died as a martyr, and there's no competing traditions whatsoever. And then as you get into the third and fourth century, all the sources agree with this. But Peter is early and it's consistent, multiple voices. I think we're on very solid ground to conclude that Peter died as a martyr. Now, I will say one thing is when I wrote the Apostles, I agreed with most scholars that Peter was probably crucified. But then I've actually started to lean towards changing my mind, because if you read John closely,
Mm-hmm.
it says you will be clothed and taken where you do not want to go. One thing we know about crucifixion is people were not clothed, is they were stripped totally bare. And that never caught, I don't know. I look at it, I'm like, how did I miss that? So it really doesn't matter how Peter died. For my case, crucified upside down, burned to death. We have consistent testimony that he believed he had seen the risen Jesus. And he went to the grave believing that and was killed in a way tied to the proclamation of his faith.
So even the skeptic that you were debating the other day agrees there's good evidence for Peter. How
He
about
did.
Paul? What evidence do we have for Paul?
So Paul, we have roughly two first century sources. Again, you have Clement at the end of the 90s, potentially Acts, depending how we understand the story and narrative of Acts. But you also have this interesting passage in Timothy, where 1 Timothy 5, I think 6 through 8 or so, where Timothy says, I fought the good fight. And he says, my life is about to be poured out like a libation. Paul writes this.
Paul said that, yeah.
Now, you and I believe that Paul wrote this because he knows he's suffering so deeply, his life is about to be taken from him. The point that I make in the book is I say, look, and even this guy, Paul, that I was debating, does not believe 1st and 2nd Timothy are genuinely Pauline. I said, okay, fine. For the sake of argument, you can have it. That means that 1 Timothy was invented by somebody who was so firmly aware that Paul suffered during his life and died in this fashion that they had to include it in this fake letter. Either way, it works in my favor that we have a strong case and tradition that Paul is suffering and he's going to be put to death in a way tied to his suffering. So at least 1 to 2 first century sources. And then you get into the 2nd century with Paul. I think there's 8 sources that we have, including Polycarp. And again, Bart Ehrman says this story in Polycarp, he's aware of a tradition of the martyrdom of Paul. In Clement, Bart Ehrman says they're aware of a tradition of the martyrdom of Paul. So we're on strong grounds with Paul, somewhere between 6 and 8 good sources, 1st and 2nd century, no competing sources whatsoever.
So there's nobody that ever says Paul recanted or Peter recanted or any of the apostles recanted.
No, and by the way, this is a really important point because both believers and skeptics would have had reason to cite if any of the apostles recanted. Why? Skeptics would use it to undermine the faith. Believers would use it. When you get into the 2nd, 3rd century, there become these debates about if somebody folds under pressure and doesn't die as a martyr, can they be allowed back into the fold and the faith? If there was even a remote tradition about Matthias or Philip doing this, don't you think somebody would have said, hey, wait, what about the story of Philip? He recanted. Clearly he's in the kingdom. So that is an argument from silence. But the way I put it is it's an argument of silence with some teeth.
Right, right. All right, so we've already been through James, the brother of Jesus, because we have Josephus talking about him, who was probably in Jerusalem at the time. Hegesippus, another writer who lived later, talks about James as well. James is the pastor of the church in Jerusalem at the time, basically. And he didn't think his own brother was God prior to the resurrection, according to John 7. But after the resurrection, 30 years later, he's dying in the city of Jerusalem as a martyr for his brother's church. Well, why would he do that? Well, you got to make a judgment there. We've talked about James, the brother of Zebedee. That's just in Acts chapter 12. And you can throw Stephen in there if you want. He's in Acts as well. Is there anybody else that you have pretty high confidence for that they did die?
Those are the only four I think we can put in first century consistent early documents.
All right.
When you get to Andrew and you get to Thomas, now you're dealing only with mid to late second century and third century documents.
All right.
And that doesn't mean it's false. It just means our historical confidence goes down. So with Andrew, I was able to find two sources. One, the Acts of Andrew, which are these legend-filled, flowery accounts of the travels of the apostles. There's the Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul. And there's crazy stories in these things, like Paul baptizes a lion. In the Acts of John, I think there's these bed bugs that are attacking him, and he commands them.
Was Trump. No, I'm just kidding. The lion's name was Trump. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. Prophecy. So these are full, like Acts of Andrew, you find these crazy accounts, but I think what happens is even in the apocryphal accounts, they're still put on like a historical core, so to speak. Because to tell these flowery accounts, they had to rely upon the traditions that were known. So that has Andrew being crucified. So there may or may not be a historical core. And then there's a second account, probably into the 3rd century, that describes Andrew dying on a tree. So they agree on crucifixion, but the way they describe it are very different. So that's enough to me to say, okay, we have two sources. They're late. You know, there's some legendary detail there, but I can't fully dismiss it. Compare that with like Bartholomew. And I mean, poor guy, there's traditions of him being burned alive, crucified, drowned, stabbed to death, skinned alive. I mean, either he had a really bad day or one or all of these were invented. I mean, you look at the images for Bartholomew and he's often standing there holding his skin. When you look at these statues in some different churches, Bartholomew would be there holding his skin. But the earliest account I could find that he was skinned alive is I think about the turn of the 6th century. So that's where I say Andrew and Thomas, maybe there's an interesting case that's there. The others, I'm not even sure we can know at all what history is or where legend begins.
As we go to questions, let's bring the great Jorge Gill on. I want to also mention, I know the question might come up about, well, if you're going to say martyrdom proves Christianity, why doesn't it approve Islam?
Yeah.
Why don't you just deal with that very briefly, Sean, before Jorge comes on and asks questions from the audience?
Yeah, so I'm very careful how I word this. I don't say in the book, and I don't say in any of my talks or debates, that the death of the apostles proves Christianity, nor does it prove the resurrection. It doesn't. All it is one small but important piece in a larger case that you and I and other apologists and New Testament scholars make for the resurrection. Namely, it shows their sincerity. It shows they weren't lying. They weren't making this up. So my friend Paul, who I debated, he says you can have the appearance of Peter, you can have the appearance of Paul. I think they probably died as martyrs. But he points to like mass hysteria and hallucinations. So their willingness to suffer and die doesn't disprove mass hallucinations. We can disprove that on other grounds.
Yeah, exactly.
But this only takes us so far. So the difference with say, I think you said a Muslim
martyrs, yeah.
I don't even use the term martyr. I think it's a homicide. It's murder. Right. That's not martyrdom when you kill somebody else doing this.
Yeah.
But say on 9/11, these people are centuries removed, and they are accepting their testimony, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th hand, whatever it is,
Right.
from the events themselves. That'd be no different than if someone comes in and kills you or I during this. They go, all right, Sean and Frank, they really believed it. But that doesn't prove anything about Christianity.
That's right.
The apostles lived with Jesus. They traveled with Jesus. They said they had seen the risen Jesus. So the truth of the proclamation that we have is tied to their claim that they saw the risen Jesus. That's why it's qualitatively different.
Yeah, they witnessed it. The Muslim martyrs of today, they just have faith it's true, but you're
Yeah,
right.
same with any Christian martyr today.
Yeah. Let's bring on the great Jorge Gill, who has some questions from the audience, I assume, our viewing audience. And let's jump right into it, Jorge. What do we got?
Well, first of all, gentlemen, it's good to be here. And also everybody watching in all of our social media accounts, make sure you share, make sure you subscribe, and make sure you stay tuned for next week as well. Andrew Green from YouTube says, what is the weaker point or points to the martyrdom argument that Christians should be cautious to avoid overstating the evidence?
I love that question. Thank you for asking it. I think here's what we need to say. Rather than saying all the apostles except John died as martyrs, therefore the resurrection happened and Christianity is true. I think we need to word it carefully. In fact, Lee Strobel did this very carefully in his in the Case for Christ years before I did this research. He said the apostles are willing to suffer and die for their belief in the risen Jesus. This shows that they didn't invent the story. I think that's the way I would put it. I would basically say the willingness of the apostles to suffer and die for their belief that they had seen the risen Jesus shows us that they're sincere. They really believe this had happened to them.
And we have really good evidence for 4, probably decent evidence for 2, and the rest we're not sure.
That's right. And by the way, I had this conversation with William Lane Craig because he said, all we have to do is show their willingness. And I said, technically, you're right. But if we can show that there's no record any of them recanted, and we do have good reason to believe that at least some of them died, I think that just strengthens the case within itself.
Good deal. Ed Shepard asks, some apostles have tombs today that are marked. How many of these are the true locations or are true?
Boy, that's a really tough question. When I first started my research, there's certain archaeological remains, like even the bodies of Peter and Paul and the different tombs. And I may revisit this someday, but I don't know how many of those can really be traced back to the 1st century and are actually reliable accounts. I didn't find the archaeological evidence very convincing for the research that I was doing. And in some ways, think about this. We all know that the apostles died. I mean, nobody questions that except maybe Mormons question the death of John, thinking he lived forever. Nobody questions that they died. So they're clearly buried somewhere. So if they have some of these tombs, that might tell us that certain traditions of the apostles going to certain cities and dying in those cities is true or reliable at most. But I guess I was torn in my research because there's a whole lot of apocryphal and invented traditions that show up. Because if early churches could say, we had an apostle found our church and he's buried here, it gives them a certain kind of authority. So some of them may be true. It's just really hard historically to assess that. So when I started this research, I didn't want to be the bad guy that rains on anybody's party who says, hey, here's where Thomas was buried. That's not my goal. But historically speaking, in an academic project, I didn't find those accounts super helpful to try to establish what I was trying to establish.
One church thought they had the skull of Paul, actually, and another church said, no, we have the skull of Paul. And the first church said, this is a full-grown skull, while your skull is just a skull of a teenager. And the other church said, oh, that's Paul's skull when he was a kid.
I got
skull, you have his adult skull.
Okay, we got this one from Veronica. She says, what were your criteria when examining Christian tradition regarding the martyrdom of the apostles?
great question. You guys have quite the listening audience, unless you're just making these up, Jorge, to try to impress me.
It's all me, man. It's
It's
all
all
me,
made
baby.
up. So
Yeah.
there's a scholar by the name of Marcus Bachmuel, and he's written a book which I would consider the most important book on the historical Peter. And in there, he talks about something called the living memory, which is the generation of the apostles, and then 2 generations removed, which gets us to about the end of the 2nd century, where you can kind of say, my parents or grandparents or maybe great-grandparents passed this down, and it's not totally hearsay, so to speak. It's still passed on within what's called a living memory up through the 2nd century. So I started by saying, how many sources do we have in that living memory, and how early and reliable are those sources? Now, the point that I make in the book is I don't totally dismiss sources that come after that. I just rate them less reliable, historically speaking, than those within the living memory. So when it comes to both James, Paul, and Peter, we have multiple sources within that living memory telling a consistent story. So Andrew and Thomas, it's towards the end of that living memory, moving beyond it. So I put it as it may be more probable, maybe. All the rest of the apostles are beyond that. So it doesn't mean the stories are false. I just didn't think we could have any historical confidence that they were really true.
I see. Now we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to ask you one more question, Sean, and then turn it back to Frank. And this one comes from Steve Jones. He says, what evidence of the tradition of the upside down crucifixion of Peter is there, and what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, another wonderful question. So the first time we have a historical record of the upside down crucifixion of Peter is in a document called the Acts of Peter that's typically dated 180 to 190. So it's right on the cusp of that living memory. And if I asked our questioner why Peter was crucified upside down, he'd probably say what we all say in the church, that Peter said to his executioners, I am too humble to be crucified like Jesus. I am not worthy of this. Please crucify me upside down. Here's my question. Do you think the Roman executioners took suggestions on how you wanted to be crucified? I'm pretty skeptical about that one as it is. But what happens is in that account, if you go read it, and you can actually read it online. If you search early Christian writings, Acts of Peter, you can read it and find it in good, reliable translations. What happens if you read it carefully, in the story, Peter is turned upside down because when he's upside down, he can actually see the world as it really is, because the world is turned upside down by sin. And then when he dies, his death, like the death of Jesus, will help turn the world right side up. So I think in this first account, it's making more of a theological point than it is historical point. Now, with that said, if you read Martin Hengel's book, Crucifixion, there is precedent of some crucifixion of people being that way upside down. So it's not impossible. I'm just very skeptical. First off, I don't think Peter was crucified. Second off, it's a late account that's making a theological, not historical account. So at best possible, but certainly not the most reliable account that we have.
But you are saying that he was indeed martyred, just probably not crucified, correct, Sean?
Yeah, probably not crucified, and even higher probability not crucified upside down.
Oh, okay, all right. Hey, as you know, we've been doing this Hope One Live broadcast for coming up on 2 months now, just because we've all been locked down. And I want to ask you this final question, Sean. What did you learn about the apostles that relates to the suffering that people in our country and around the world are experiencing now?
You know what, Frank, when I first started doing this research, I read the entire New Testament carefully. And I noted every single time there was either a teaching from Jesus or the apostles or another biblical writer, or an event of some kind of persecution or suffering because of the faith. And I was stunned at how central the idea is that if you follow Jesus, it's going to cost you something. And frankly, I was a little disappointed myself. I was like, man, how did I not see this before? There's such a gospel of health and wealth, and Jesus wants to give you A, B, or C. in the church today that when I read it and I underlined and circled and I made notes, every single book from Jesus saying, pick up your cross and follow me. Well, I've heard people interpret that like saying, you know, my cross is my neighbor just blares loud rock music, or my boss is just overbearing, or whatever, or my spouse or my kids. That's not what Jesus meant. Jesus meant when you follow me, you are prepared to lay down your life just like I did. So I think we've missed that in the church today. And this whole COVID-19 is maybe I'm not saying God is doing it for this, but maybe it can get us to go back and say, do we have a good theology of suffering? And I don't think we do. In fact, you and I have seen this in the LGBTQ conversation. There's a lot of concern about religious liberty and freedom, and people are fighting for the rights. And I say, you know what, we should, because religious liberty is a good objective within itself.
Right.
But on the other hand, Jesus, if you just read what Jesus said, we shouldn't be surprised that the world hates us. We shouldn't be surprised that the world is broken. The question is not, is this a broken world? I mean, sometimes the world is so surprised because we think we can control everything with science. We think we can fix everything with science. And this thing comes around and all the experts are fumbling all over themselves. And it reminds us we don't have as much control as we think we have, which is why in Luke 13, Jesus asked about natural and moral evil. Those killed distinctly, the Galileans whose blood was mixed in the sacrifices, and then the Tower of Siloam falls, which is natural evil. And he basically says, repent, repent. And you can't say that Jesus is insensitive by saying this. He's the most compassionate person who's ever lived. So as I study this, and as it brings us into this crazy quarantine right now, it just reminds me that we need a theology of suffering rooted in God's goodness, rooted that God is molding our character through this. And we cannot control our circumstances, but we can control how we respond. And I think one reason God allows this kind of suffering and pain, and why he allowed the apostles to die as martyrs, is because when you look in the early church, it was the compassion and confidence the apostles had when they were being put to death that drew many people to consider the faith. So we need to learn to suffer well because it conforms us to the character of Christ. But second, a world around us is watching. And that's how God wants us to suffer through this. So I would invite your listeners, if you're going to read any book, first just go read the New Testament. Look at the writing before you read, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. That can be number 2, and it's up there. And we're waiting for the update, by the way, Frank. That's number 2. Just read the New Testament. Read the book of James. Read Hebrews. Read Acts. And see how central this idea is that followers of Jesus will suffer. But God hasn't left us. He redeems us through this. God is present with us, and he's in control.
Yeah, well said. There's 2 questions we need to ask ourselves when we start asking questions about suffering. And the first question is, well, why did God allow Jesus to suffer? For a greater good, right? He was innocent.
Yeah.
We're innocent. And I think the second question we need to ask ourselves when we say, well, why doesn't God stop the coronavirus or stop any evil? We might want to ask ourselves the question, why doesn't God stop us? Because we do evil every day. Because he allows us free will, and free will is the only way we can love. And that's why Jesus came to love us. When you're going through suffering, you know that it's not that Jesus doesn't care because he went through it for our benefit. It's the idea that he can bring good from it, and he does. So, Sean, thanks so much. I know that a lot of people are interested in the fate of the apostles. I know they're probably looking at the price on Amazon because it was a dissertation. Have you written on this anywhere else, or have you done podcasts on it, you did a podcast with us about 5 years ago on it, but is there any place they can get more information without having to spend $100,
So 2 things. The paperback's $50. If somebody's like, I got to have it. If you actually email me through my site, seanmcdowell.org, I can send you like a 35% discount code, which is basically the discount I get. So if you really want the academic research, email me, I'll send you that code. But actually, in the updated Evidence That Demands a Verdict, one of the new features is I have a chapter on the death of the apostles. And I basically summarize that whole book in 10 pages and give all, what those references are. And amazingly, you can read those online today. Excellent. With good sources. They're available to everybody. So probably Evidence would be the best place to go.
Evidence Demands a Verdict. If you don't have that, that's one of the books that brought me to faith. It's been updated twice now, most recently by Sean and his father, Josh. Wonderful book, wonderful resource. So get Evidence Demands a Verdict. Also go to SeanMcDowell.org, as you can see there. And Sean has also been teaching a course for us called Addressing Homosexuality with Clarity and Compassion. You can still take that course in the basic version. If you go to crossexamine.org and click on online courses, and we'll run it in a live Zoom format again in the future. A lot of people have been blessed by what you've done in that course, Sean. So thanks so much. And I know you got to go to another Zoom, so go ahead.
That course is A+. I did not know what to expect. This is my first course with you, but we got a lot of students in there. They're asking amazing questions. The content is great. I could just tell you some of the stories that have come out of this, that people are encouraged and they're inspired. And I would do it again in a heartbeat. And on top of that, love you guys. You're doing such good work at Cross Examine. Be encouraged. Keep it up. Grateful to call you partners in the faith. So thanks for having me on.
Thanks, brother. And we'll see everybody else here on Monday. Thanks for staying with us. You guys have a great weekend. God bless.
Bye-bye.